All right. Hello, everybody. Marginal Non-hermit here, and I have for you today a review of the book The White Pill by Michael Malice. I guess technically the full title is The White Pill, A Tale of Good and Evil. So here is the quite attractive hardcover. Simple but nice looking. Has kind of a 70s styling going on here, which is kind of nice. Goofy colors. Anyway, I just finished this book, and I wanted to say that it is not what I expected, and actually I think that's a good thing. So, Michael Malice is well known for being a proliferous internet troll and very pithy statements at sometimes on Twitter. And the concepts of white pill and black pill and blue pill and red pill get tossed around with a lot of pithiness on the internet as well. And so Malice could have really gotten away with writing a witty but surface level book about the importance of keeping a positive mindset. Instead, what he has created is the most insidious Tootsie Roll pop ever. It is jet black on the outside, but there's just a tiny little chunk of white at the very center. The White Pill isn't a boring book on optimism, but instead it's a deeply disturbing and detailed account of the rise and fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, with a few relevant side stories to keep things fresh. So, the first chapter of the book talks about Ayn Rand and her rise to fame as a novelist and an anti-communist speaker. Malice sets the stage by showing how she, was very clear and uncompromising about being against communism in the face of mealy-mouthed and largely irrelevant statements given by others who really hadn't ever experienced life under it. Her revulsion against communism and her clear understanding of the mental torture that life under communism becomes is explained pretty well by a series of quotes in the book, mostly from her testimony to Congress on the subject. For instance, there's one really good one. She said, "Try to imagine what it is like if you are in constant terror from morning until night, and at night you're waiting for the doorbell to ring, where you are afraid of anything and everybody, living in a country where human life is nothing, less than nothing, and you know it." What Malice is doing here is he's showing you the kind of terror that totalitarianism produces, and this first chapter, focusing on Rand, is just a little taste of what's to come. So, Malice continues his narrative with a look at the anarchists in the early 20th century. He talks about a bunch of prominent anarchists, how they were captured, possibly framed, executed, or died in some other method. And he also talks about how when the USSR got started, a lot of these anarchists thought this was a shining beacon of hope. But his discussion of Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, who got deported to the USSR and saw its atrocities firsthand, is really, really, really interesting. Both of these people realized that the Soviet rhetoric about freedom and equality was actually just rhetoric, and that there wouldn't be any relief for the workers after Lenin's coup. Malice then proceeds gruesomely through the atrocities of Lenin and Stalin. There are grisly descriptions of state-caused famine in Ukraine, torture, show trials not just of dissidents, but of the upper echelons of the Communist Party. The Cheka gets a deep look, and some of its tactics Malice talks about. He paints a picture of a massive meat grinder in which denouncing one's friends and family is expected, and high officials are frequently shoved into the grinder because they either knew too much or too little. People who made basic mistakes get thrown into gulags, get crushed. People who knew these tactics got crushed as well. The culture that this kind of force creates is terrifying and degenerative. It results in not just general terror and oppression and depression and, awfulness everywhere. But Malice also notes how this culture resulted in massive spikes in incompetence, both in military and medical fields. Now, the book is not jet black all the way through. In order to give the reader a little bit of a rest, the book goes into a few less gruesome side stories. He has a full-throated denouncement of Walter Duranty's efforts to hide Soviet atrocities from exposure to the Western public, as well as discussion of some of the journalists who are more on the side of good there. Gareth Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge are two of the standouts. Both of them made efforts to expose what was going on in the USSR at significant personal risk. There's a discussion of Upton Sinclair's blind support of communism. There's a story about Henry Wallace, who the U.S. managed to just barely avoid having as president. The book is punctuated by a variety of humorous but very dark anecdotes that help illustrate the evils of communism. Some of them come from Stalin himself. So after we get through Stalinism, it's here that we kind of get the first fleeting little hint of the white pill flavor. So what happens is Khrushchev comes to power after Stalin dies, and Khrushchev denounces this, cult of personality that Stalinism was. Malice goes into a lot of detail on this, and Malice makes it clear and reminds you, which is important, that these people were themselves the creators and enforcers of this very culture that they eventually decided to speak out against. However, the point is that this crushing force of what they created became too much for them to maintain. So we get a little bit of rest there, but then Malice goes into detail of the USSR putting down revolutions in satellite states, and then he starts talking about East Germany. He goes into the atrocities that the Stasi committed. He details the rise of the Berlin Wall, and kind of hits you hard with these heart-wrenching stories of people attempting to escape to West Berlin, and some of them succeeded and some of them failed. But at this point in the book, you now see that the fall of communism is coming, and now Malice is able to start moving in a slightly more positive direction. So next up, we start seeing the appearances of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev. This is the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. Malice handles these events deftly, like a classical dramatist. He shows these people having their ups and downs, their strengths, their weaknesses, as they dealt with this incoming collapse of the Soviet system. And we start to see bits of light in the darkness. He uses these to push us through to the end. For instance, he talks about it's almost comedic. There's a series of mistakes and misapprehensions that led to the sudden and mostly unexpected fall of the Berlin Wall, and soon after that, the collapse of the Soviet Union, under immense pressure because most of its people were leaving now that there was no physical wall preventing them from getting into the West. Later on, Boris Yeltsin makes an appearance, and the story of how he faced down a potential coup is really gripping. And at the very end of the book, there's that final little chunk of white pill, and I'm not going to spoil what Malice says to get you there. You should go read the book. If I had to give the book criticism in any significant way, I would note that the biggest thing I missed out of the book is what I think is a missed opportunity. There should have been a little bit more white pill in that very dark middle of the book. Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the story of Samizdat in Russia are amazing stories of perseverance and resistance against evil. And unfortunately, they only get very minor appearances in the book. It would have been amazing to hear some of these stories of heroism and, attempts at free expression from behind the Iron Curtain. One other minor criticism I have is that there's the section on Henry Wallace where the way that the book is written, it seems to conclude that Wallace was kind of a useful idiot and not really a potential tyrant. And however, I listen to Malice on podcasts and stuff like that, and from what I've heard him say, he kind of thinks more along the lines that keeping Wallace out of the presidency was pretty much dodging a bullet. The book doesn't really get that across as well. It kind of makes him look like a mostly harmless fool who was tricked by Stalin's Potemkin villages and wouldn't really have ever tried to implement the elements of Stalinism that turned it into a terror. He was a communist sympathizer. Wallace was a communist sympathizer, but the conclusion that I drew from reading the book was that he wouldn't really ever have done any of the really bad stuff that Stalin did. But maybe the point I'm missing is that the force that trying to implement even little bits of communism would have pushed Wallace in that direction, or created an opportunity for someone like Stalin to take power after Wallace. That's actually a good thought there, maybe. Other thing I would have to say is that I found a handful of minor but noticeable typographical errors, and a few cases where a person was referenced suddenly, but only by their last name after a long period of not being mentioned. And so for some of the minor, this happened a couple of times where there was someone who was like, oh, who's that person? I had to flip back and try to find the earlier reference to that person. Both of these probably could have been fixed by one more careful reading before publication, but these small issues don't really affect the immense value that this book has in any meaningful way. One other point, and this is kind of a side issue of my own personal interest, is Malice has always said that you should read The Fountainhead before Atlas Shrugged. And, I was kind of afraid to ask him this question, or whatever, because I figured he would probably just troll me on it. But in this book, I think that I got kind of a hint that kind of led me to an answer here. So whereas The Fountainhead, so a little bit more background. I read them in the reverse order. I read Atlas Shrugged first, and then The Fountainhead after that. And my opinion is that The Fountainhead is not as clear, not as gripping, not as engaging as as Atlas Shrugged. And so, my question in my head was, well, why read The Fountainhead first? And in this book, Malice notes that The Fountainhead was about the freedom of creativity and expression, the freedom of men's souls, and it focuses on that, as opposed to, Atlas Shrugged covers that, but covers a lot of stuff in addition to that. And so that kind of gives me an idea, I think, of why Malice says read The Fountainhead first, because it's more focused on this one very, very basic and important issue, that freedom of thought and freedom to create is really the basis for a lot of the other freedoms that we also need. So, just to conclude, The White Pill is a book you should definitely read, but I warn you that you need to set aside the time to read it in full, in a couple of sittings, or not much more than that. Because what will happen if you pick it up and stop in the middle is that it'll just make you angry and sad, and it'll fill you with despair, because what you're seeing is the absolute worst mankind has to offer. And the end of the book, the really important part, is that little ray of hope at the end of the book. And if you skip, and you could skip to the end to find out what that little ray of hope is, but if you do that, then you won't be able to feel the weight that little ray of hope holds within it, by knowing what happened in the previous chunk of the book. So give it a look, give it your attention. Don't open it without a like a desire to finish it in a relatively short period. It's a little over 300 pages, not too huge a font or anything like that, or not too small a font or anything like that. So it's not that long of a read, but you really do need to give it the time that it deserves. So, thank you.